The Russian invasion on Ukraine has initiated a new wave of emphasis on NATO's expansion in the Western Balkans from the West. In the 2 decades-long NATO integration process, only 3 out of 6 countries of the Western Balkans have become NATO members. Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Kosovo are the only 3 countries in the region that have not yet joined NATO. In March 2022, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg identified Bosnia and Herzegovina as a potential area of Russian activities, followed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. While Serbia leans towards military neutrality, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo have recognized NATO integration as the nation's strategic ambition and seek military expenditures. Military expenditure of Bosnia and Herzegovina has been almost the same in the past 5 years. Almost 90% of the defense budget in 2021 was spent on personnel due to the political deadlock. Serbia military spending has experienced a sharp increase in 2021. Military spending took up an increasing share of the total expenditure from 4% in 2017 to 8.6% in 2021. Some 3,500 allied and partner troops operates in Kosovo as part of the NATO's KFOR peacekeeping force. Allies also provide air policing support to smaller Balkan allies. What are the key factors that are delaying an incomplete NATO integration in the Western Balkans? And should new strategies be implemented in the NATO enlargement process? More on this matter will be discussed with my colleague Harun Kacic, with his guest Viola Gienger, editor at Just Security.
So Viola, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, there is a lot of talk about Russian influence in the Balkans, especially in Serbia and in the Republika Srpska. Milorad Dodik's inflammatory rhetoric is well known. Viewed from Washington, is this something that concerns you as an American observer and analyst?
It's great to be with you, Harun. Thank you very much. And just to note that I am just speaking in my own capacity here. Yes, this pattern has emerged over recent years with Russian influence supporting and exacerbating what was already an increasingly tense environment, as you know, as the Bosnian Serb leadership and the leadership in Serbia next door became ever more belligerent in its rhetoric against other groups in Bosnia. And this has echoes, of course, in the inflamed tensions that led up to the wars of the 1990s. So that's the backdrop. This has happened before. We see it, we hear it, and it has to be short-circuited immediately. But I'm afraid that too little has been done to this date. This has been going on for a very long time. Shortly after I left Bosnia in 2003, and things began to start to deteriorate, and the hardliners sort of reconsolidated their power, and people became increasingly dissatisfied with the direction that things were going, naturally enough. And that was 20 years ago, and it has only gotten worse.
Right.
So I think it's really important to try to take preemptive, peaceful action as soon as possible to try to sort of prevent that sort of downward trajectory that we're seeing right now. But a lot of people, both in the West and probably to a certain extent in Bosnia, there's a lot of people are very, very concerned. But I also think there's always a bit of denial in these situations. Nobody really thinks it'll ever come to war. That was certainly true in Ukraine. Nobody ever thought it would get to the level of an all-out invasion, even though that had been threatened for more than a year before it happened. So I think we have to be really alert and careful and move quickly and carefully to try to forestall any kind of deterioration. Right. And I think American and European leaders are starting to understand the severity of the risks. You saw that even as early as 2021, The report, the Guardian reported at the time that the High Representative Schmidt, just a few months after coming into office, sent a report to the United Nations, just months after he took office, saying that the Bosnian Serb leadership's escalating agitation for secession and the repeated sort of police and military and paramilitary gamesmanship were heightening tensions to such an extent. He said Bosnia was on the verge of breaking up. And you see that also, that realization, even more in the past, say, 6 months or so, on the part of NATO, even going back to last year's NATO conference. But we could talk a little bit more about that later.
Right. But if such inflammatory rhetoric comes from high-ranking Serbian officials, such as Aleksandar Vulin, who was the interior minister, the defense minister, who now heads Serbia's intelligence agency and has very close ties to Moscow and advocates the creation of a Serbian world, should this be should this be a bigger concern to the West?
I think it's a very serious concern. At Just Security, where I work, we have been publishing a tracker since last year, compiling Russian rhetoric against Ukraine that dehumanizes Ukrainians and calls for the elimination of Ukrainians as a people or as a culture, for the elimination of Ukraine as a state. That's sort of eliminationist and even in many instances genocidal rhetoric. It illustrates the many forms that warfare can take, and it has frightening dimensions. And I see some of this Serbian and Bosnian Serb leadership rhetoric going in that direction, seeming to try to delegitimize internationally recognized states and peoples and ethnic groups, vilifying others, spreading disinformation. The denial of the genocide at Srebrenica is part of that. And that's really concerning because it foments anger and on various sides, and it begins this sort of, it contributes to the downward spiral. So I think that's definitely something to be very concerned about. Legitimate scholars have done great work trying to shut down denial of that kind, genocide denial at Srebrenica, but it's a constant effort. And I think that's something that's a really important point in any kind of democratic system. I mean, certainly we have had huge problems here in the United States in recent years, as your audience will be aware of hard line, aggressive rhetoric, hate speech, and it's a constant. It requires constant vigilance, and everybody needs to be paying attention and pushing back at that. There's no more of this. I think we need to get past this idea that, we all sit down at a dinner table and nobody should talk politics because that would upset people. I think we need to talk politics a lot more than we do.
Viola, when it comes to the Western Balkans, should NATO be considering any additional infrastructure investments or even troop deployments in the region?
I think it has gotten to that point, and I think NATO, while they may not be talking so much about NATO troop deployments, they are definitely taking some actions to try to fortify their own presence and how their presence is focused. And at the same time, you see some increases in the EU force, the U4 force. So, right after the war, NATO had 60,000 troops in Bosnia after the war for some years. And then that declined, of course. And then in 2004, NATO pulled out and EU4 took over. And they had something like 7,000 troops at the beginning, EU4 did. And then that has declined over the years, I think possibly as low as 700 a few years ago. And now it's coming back up again. I think the numbers are getting maybe back up to around 1,300, depending on how you count it. But I think that's something. And they make a point of noting EUFOR does, of noting that it can be reinforced by troops from the NATO mission in Kosovo and other over-the-horizon forces.
Now,
so I think that's just an important signal.
Right. Now, Viola, I mean, just how significant is the Balkan region for the transatlantic alliance following the invasion of Ukraine? Are we in the Balkans once again back under NATO's radar?
I think I would say two things. One, the Balkans, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and all of the effects of that are the priority in many ways right now, of course, in U.S. foreign policy, in European foreign policy, or European policy generally. But at the same time, it has also opened some eyes in Europe, and to a certain extent in the United States as well, about the dangers and how these kind of situations spiral downward, and then, and increasingly accelerated pace. And so I think there has been a growing realization since the NATO summit last year in Madrid, which I attended, that this is a dangerous situation in the Western Balkans and in Bosnia specifically, and the games that Serbia is playing next door. And there's a growing realization, and you can see it in NATO rhetoric.
Viola, let me put it bluntly. Why would it be in the interest of any particular Western Balkan state to join the North Atlantic Alliance?
I think that's a good question, and it's a legitimate question for people in Bosnia and the Western Balkans to ask specifically. I think the important thing to remember is not only the military protection and the deterrence value, but also the political alliance that NATO represents. An alliance built on values. And, we can be honest and forthright about how NATO hasn't always lived up to those values, and the NATO countries don't always live up to those values. It is a constant iterative process, certainly. But to have those goals, to have those aspirations, and to be working toward those, and to have allies who are constantly reminding each other of those values, I think that's really important. And that's a benefit to internal politics of member countries as well.
Right. Now, I mean, the global trend of democracy erosion impacted the Western Balkans as well. Fragile democracies are another issue as they threaten regional stability. So what are the biggest security challenges stemming from the unconsolidated state of Western Balkan democracies?
I think that it is a security challenge in many ways, because as long as they are unconsolidated and unstable, or as long as there are hardline figures in charge, there may be a perception in the realm of realpolitik that this may lend some degree of stability if it's the same leader over a certain period of time, etc. The devil kind of argument. I think there's a real danger in that, because it's a false stability. So I do think it is a serious security risk to Europe, and therefore to the United States, because Europe and a consolidated, unified, progressive moving European continent is really important for the United States to all of its other foreign policy prerogatives. The potential threats from China, the developments in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America. The United States needs European partners. It needs a strong Europe, a strong and democratic Europe to work with as partners. and
Right.
to work with all of these other countries jointly across the globe.
Do you think it was a mistake for the U.S. to pull out of the region and essentially outsource its peacekeeping and state-building efforts to the EU and leave the job unfinished in the Balkans?
Yes, I'm afraid that is the case, actually. You know, I think as much as we talk about and acknowledge that the United States credibility has been under legitimate question for quite some time now globally, you still hear over and over again people all over the world, pro-democracy forces all over the world, and I mean the peaceful ones, looking to, as well as some of the pro-democracy forces who are fighting in places, looking to the United States for leadership. There's something, I mean, not only is it the most powerful military in the world, but the values, that those aspirations are still incredibly inspirational and powerful. And the democratic forces need that kind of support, whether it's moral support or political support or military support in some cases. So yeah, I think that's a mistake. We do have a problem with short-termism in the United States and as well in Europe. I think at times we get very comfortable over a certain period of time and figure, oh, you know, they've got this. They can handle this on their own. But as long as people there are around the world are still seeking U.S. support, I think the U.S. needs to be there to provide that because it is in our own interests in the long term.
Right, but what is the general mood now in Washington among, you know, the political circles when it comes to the Balkans and Eastern Europe as a whole?
I still think there's a very high level of interest, not only in the political and leadership circles, but also among the American public. I think Americans get it. And I think this, that brutal all-out Russian invasion of Ukraine and the damage that it has done has been a blunt reminder of how important the European region is, and for the rest of the world. And I think the mood is still determined. Now, you know, we hear the rhetoric as long as it takes in terms of support for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The problem, of course, has been brought out frequently, that as long as it takes for what? You know, right. As long as it should be as long as it takes for Ukraine to win, but that needs to be quickly, because there always is a risk that other crises will overtake. So I think there's a sense of urgency. I don't think that has receded, which is a good sign. I think there's still, but I think it takes constant tending and constant attention.
Right. But finally, I mean, when you look at the Balkans from you know, your perspective now, do you think it's of a higher importance for Balkan states, Western Balkan states, that is, to join the EU or NATO, or are the two completely intertwined?
I think they are intertwined. I think it is really important, not only for the military protection, but also for the political community that EU membership and NATO membership provides. It is a community based on democratic values, and it can bolster the democratic interests in all of these countries. I think we still have a long way to go within both NATO and the European Union and the Transatlantic Alliance to support those kind of interests as strongly as we should be and as strongly as we have the capacity to do. And I think we have more capacity than we are exerting at the moment. So I really hope that we can continue to press in that direction and support what I understand is still the desire of Bosnians and the citizens of the Western Balkans to have a quote unquote normal life, and to have a normal life and stability, true stability, sustainable stability. I think you need that democratic structure. I think you need citizen engagement, and I think you need the community that NATO and EU membership can provide.
Right. Viola, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you for your interest, and it's a great topic. Thank you.
Global pressure from the Western allies remains urgent to push for NATO's completion in the Western Balkans. However, one of the main factors that drive Western Balkan countries away from NATO accession is Russia's military presence. Serbian-Russian relations have created a Russian office within the Serbian Ministry of Defense and are increasing joint military exercises, with 96 in 2019. China's economic and infrastructure projects are also placed in the Western Balkans to gain its footprint. In Serbia, the total amount of Chinese funding has reached $11 billion. With both Russia and China's interference, Russia's ambitions in the Western Balkans poses a larger risk due to its wider range of influence that exceeds economic investments compared to China. While efforts towards NATO membership continue, Russia at the same time seeks to take advantage of political and ethnic divisions in the Western Balkans.